He had broken empires with less effort than it took him to cross a room. Duke Lucien Dravenmere had reduced grown men to silence with a single glance, had redrawn the borders of 3 provinces through sheer force of will, had made every powerful soul in the capital understand, without a single word of threat, that his favor was currency and his displeasure was ruin. He had never once questioned whether what he held could be lost. That was the precise and catastrophic error of a man who had spent so long conquering everything around him that he forgot to ask what it meant to deserve any of it. Watch what happens when the one person who stayed through all of it finally decides to leave, and whether a man like that can survive becoming what he made her feel all along, irrelevant. Well, the morning Seraphina Vale decided she was done. The sky over Veltherin looked the same as it always had. That was the thing that kept snagging at the back of her mind as she dressed without calling for her maid. The profound indifference of the light, the pale gold of early autumn coming through the tall windows of her suite in Dravenmere Hall, falling across the floorboards the same way it had for 3 years, making the same amber rectangles on the Persian runner, warming the same side of the same carved bedpost she had gripped during nightmares she never told anyone about. The world outside had not received a memo. The city had not gone gray in sympathy. The season had not paused to register that Lady Seraphina Vale, companion to the most feared nobleman in the empire, had spent the night staring at the ceiling and arriving at last at a decision that felt less like resolve and more like exhaustion, finally outrunning hope. She buttoned her own dress. Dark green wool, high collar, nothing decorative, the kind of thing she wore when she wanted to feel like herself rather than an accessory. The mirror gave her back a face she recognized, which was more than she could say for most mornings in this house. Pale. Still. The faintest shadow under gray eyes that came from years of trying to decode a man who had decided long ago that being understood was a vulnerability he could not afford. She looked at herself for a long moment, the way you look at something you are about to leave behind, cataloging it, fixing it in memory, making sure you carry the honest version rather than the softened one. Then she set her shoulders and went to find him. Lucien Dravenmere was in the East Study at that hour, which she knew because she had learned the geography of his habits the way a sailor learns a coastline, not from charts, but from years of near misses and silent observation. The East Study meant he had been awake since before dawn. It meant whatever was occupying his mind had been worth more to him than sleep. It usually meant figures, territorial correspondence, or the slow architectural demolition of someone's political standing. The East Study was where he went to be effective. It was not a room that knew how to be anything else. She knocked once, a clean sound, and entered without waiting for permission. He was at the long mahogany desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbows, papers arranged in the precise overlapping system only he understood. He did not look up immediately. That small delay, so habitual she had stopped noticing it, and only now, today, felt its full weight, said everything about the hierarchy he had built between them without ever announcing it out loud. You waited on Lucien Dravenmere's attention. You did not demand it. Seraphina, her name in his voice, low and even, carrying the faint texture of someone who had been reading numbers for 2 hours. Not warm, not cold either. Just functional. The way you might acknowledge a lamp you just registered was lit. Lucien. She stayed near the door. That choice was deliberate. If she came closer, the room would do what it always did. Contract around him, make him the center of gravity, reduce her to an orbit she had not consciously signed up for. He set down his pen. That, at least, was something. He looked at her then, those pale eyes doing the thing they always did, which was assess before they engaged, scan before they softened. She had spent years telling herself the softening proved something. This morning, she was less certain. "You're dressed," he said. "I tend to be, yes." A faint edge entered his expression. Not irritation exactly, more the way a chess player looks when a piece moves unexpectedly. "It's early." "It is." She clasped her hands in front of her, loose, deliberate. "I wanted to ask you something. I decided last night that I needed to ask you plainly and that I needed to do it in the morning before the day took over and made it easy to postpone." He leaned back slightly in his chair, the the posture of a man who had learned to hear difficult things without showing they were difficult. Go ahead. The light was still doing its ordinary, unbothered thing across the floorboards. Somewhere below them, the house was stirring. The distant sound of the kitchens, a door, the particular low creak of the main stair that had never been fixed because Lucien did not find it worth fixing. Small sounds. The sounds of a life she had fitted herself into so carefully, over so much time, that she had almost stopped questioning whether it fit back. "What am I to you?" she said. The quiet that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of quiet that has texture. Lucien's expression did not collapse or shift dramatically. That was the thing about him, the thing that was maddening and impressive in equal measure. He was almost never caught visibly off guard. What happened instead was subtler, a fraction of stillness in his face that was different from his ordinary stillness. The difference between a man thinking and a man stalling while thinking. "That's a broad question," he said. "I know. I'm asking it anyway." He looked at her for a moment longer than he usually allowed himself to look at things he had not yet decided how to handle. "You're—" a pause, microscopic, almost undetectable, present in my life in ways that are— "Don't." The word came out quiet but definite. "Don't do the thing where you find a formulation that sounds like an answer and isn't one. I've watched you do that with half the court for 3 years. You don't have to do it with me." Something crossed his face. Not offense exactly. Closer to the look of a man who has just discovered a door he thought he had locked is actually open. "You're useful to me," he said. The words landed with the precise weight of something carefully chosen and deeply wrong. She nodded. Once. Slow. The way you nod when you've just confirmed something you were hoping would be disproved. "Useful," she repeated. "That isn't a dismissal." His voice had gone slightly more deliberate, the way it did when he was explaining something he believed should be obvious. "I rely on your— Lucien." She cut him off gently, and the gentleness was somehow worse than sharpness would have been. "I didn't ask whether I serve a function. I asked what I am to you." "Those aren't different questions." "They are entirely different questions." He held her gaze. She held his. And in the space between them, something that had been constructed over 3 years, carefully, unconsciously, with the particular architecture of 2 people who had never once named what they were building, made a sound like settling weight before a collapse. "You want me to assign you a category," he said, and there was an edge in it now, something almost defensive under the precision. "To tell you where you rank. That kind of accounting," she said quietly, "is what you do with ledgers, Lucien. I'm asking about your life, not your ledgers." He stood. The movement was controlled, but it happened, and she had learned to read the significance of when his body moved to meet something his words hadn't resolved. He came around the side of the desk, not toward her, parallel to her, toward the window, hands behind his back in that habit he had when he was working through something. "You are a woman of considerable intelligence and discretion," he said, looking out at the morning she had already accepted as indifferent. "You have been a consistent presence and a reliable counsel. Your understanding of court politics exceeds most of my actual advisors, and your— Stop!" The word was barely above a whisper. He turned. "You are describing a staff member," Seraphina said, and her voice was steady in a way that cost her, because the steadiness was not the absence of feeling. It was what happened when feeling had been organized for long enough that it moved like a clean current rather than a broken one. "You are describing someone you employ, someone you value for competence and utility." She paused. "That's what I am to you. That's actually what you said." "I said you were useful. You said useful first." She tilted her head very slightly. "There were a dozen other words available to you. 100. I gave you all the time in the world to find one of them, and the one your mind produced first, without strategy or preparation, was useful." Her voice stayed even. "That's not your worst quality, Lucien. Your worst quality is that you believe useful is enough. That you have organized your life around the idea that being depended upon is the same as being loved." The silence this time was different. It had a different shape. "Seraphina, I'm leaving the hall today, she said, not the city. My brother has a townhouse near Caldermere Square. I'll be there. She exhaled once, almost imperceptible, the single concession to the fact that her chest had been tight since before dawn. I'm not doing this in anger. I want you to know that. This isn't a performance, and it isn't leverage. I simply realized last night that I have spent 3 years making myself available to someone who has never once been curious about whether I was all right. A pause. That's not a judgment on who you are. It's just information I was too hopeful to process for too long. He looked at her. And Lucien Dravenmere, who had looked at things all his life with the cool, evaluative clarity of a man who believed that clear seeing was the highest form of intelligence, looked at her now with something she had never seen on his face before. He looked, for a single unguarded moment, like someone who didn't know what to do. You'll come back, he said. And the certainty in it, the absence of doubt, the reflex assumption, was the last thing she needed to hear to know she was absolutely correct. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she turned, walked to the door, and left. She was gone by noon. Lucien stood at the tall east window and watched the carriage cross the drive below, 2 trunks on the back, Seraphina's maid helping her settle in before the footman shut the door. From this height and distance she was too small to read, but he watched anyway because it was something he could do while the specific and unprecedented sensation of not knowing what had just happened moved through him like cold water finding level. She had said she would be at Caldermere Square. He knew exactly where the Vale townhouse was. He had walked past it twice in 12 years of living in this city without giving it particular thought, the way you don't think about the furniture in rooms you have no reason to enter. He had fully expected her to come back before the carriage reached the main gate. She did not come back. He turned from the window when the carriage passed the iron gate and disappeared into the avenue's morning traffic, turned back to his desk, sat down, picked up his pen and looked at the document he had been assessing and found that he could read the words but could not produce what they meant. Useful, she had said. That's the word you chose. He set the pen down. What other word was he supposed to have used? What word was accurate? He ran through the catalog with the kind of brutal honesty he applied to everything, financials, strategy, consequence, and found himself arriving uncomfortably at several options he had simply never deployed. Important, necessary, irreplaceable. Words that were technically accurate given the evidence and yet had not occurred to him in the 3 seconds he'd had to answer a direct question she had been too patient to ask for years. He was aware, with the dry precision he brought to most self-assessments, that this was not his finest moment. He also remained confident she would be back within the week. She was not back within the week. She was not back in 2. What arrived instead, in increments, through the social circulatory system of Veltheron's court, was something far more inconvenient. Information about how Seraphina Vale, free of the gravitational pull of Dravenmere Hall, moved through the world when she was not adjusting herself to orbit someone else. She attended the Duchess Miraval's evening salon and spoke for 40 minutes on the intersection of grain policy and provincial taxation in a way that reportedly left 2 senior ministers looking as though they had just been handed a problem they hadn't realized existed. She was at the Caldermere Gallery opening and stayed 3 hours, not because she was being seen but because she was apparently interested in the work. She had lunch twice with the Countess Valen, who told someone who told Lucien's very uncomfortable secretary that Seraphina seemed, in the Countess's words, remarkably well. Remarkably well. He received this intelligence and did nothing with it, because the intelligence was not actionable in any way that made sense to him. The correct move, he had always believed, was to wait. She would understand, eventually, that whatever she thought she needed from him was not a real requirement. She was a practical woman. She would return, and they would resume. He was still believing this in a controlled, analytical way when he arrived at the Veltheron Imperial Assembly for the annual autumn convocation and saw her standing near the east pillar of the Great Hall, speaking to someone he didn't immediately recognize. Then he did recognize him. Then every piece of the controlled analytical confidence reorganized itself into something with a different texture entirely. Prince Kael Voren. There was no missing him, which was clearly the intent. Height, bearing, the particular quality of physical presence that came from having been told from birth that every room you entered was yours by right. He was a year or two younger than Lucien, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed in the deep blue that the Vorin line treated as something close to a territorial claim. He had arrived in Veltharin 6 days ago for what the official correspondence described as a diplomatic visit. Two empires historically competitive, currently in a cautious détente that required occasional performance. Lucien had read the briefing, filed it, thought nothing particular. He thought something particular now. Because Kael Vorin was not speaking to Seraphina the way people spoke to Seraphina at Veltharin court functions, which was to say, with the faintly distracted courtesy of people who knew she was accomplished and interesting and also closely associated with Dravenmere, which meant they were always slightly performing for an audience of one. Kael was looking at her the way someone looks when the other person is the entire point of the conversation. Not the conversation's context, not its useful backdrop, but its actual content. He was laughing, not a polished laugh, not the social laugh that Lucien used when laughter was called for and the desired impression required it. The kind where the sound came out and the eyes remained at professional distance. This was a laugh that reached his face, the kind that happened when something was genuinely funny instead of strategically so. And Seraphina was responding to it. She had her head tilted slightly, that particular angle she took when she was genuinely interested in what someone was saying, rather than being politely present for it. He knew that angle. He had seen it directed at books, at pieces of art she found worth standing in front of, at problems that struck her as worthy puzzles. He had occasionally, he now recognized with a discomfort he was not accustomed to, been the object of it, in the early period. Less so later, when she'd presumably learned that his conversation ran toward the efficient, and that genuine curiosity from her end was not typically a texture he matched. He watched her laugh at whatever Kael Vorin had said. The sensation that moved through him was not something he had a practiced word for, because it was not something he had required a word for before now. It lived somewhere in the upper chest and carried a temperature he didn't like. It made him want to cross the room in a way that was not strategic. He did not cross the room. That, at least, his self-possession held. Hiss, Lord Avery Selwick, who had been Lucien's senior advisor for 11 years and had survived that tenure by being useful in the specific way Lucien actually valued, efficient, clear, unsentimental, appeared at his elbow with the expression of a man who was calculating several things simultaneously and had decided to deploy none of them. Vorin is making the rounds, Selwick said. I can see that. He's been at court 3 days in an official capacity. He's... A pause. Well liked. Apparently. Most princes are. It's in the job description. He spent an hour and a half at the Miraval salon 2 nights ago. Selwick watched the room with careful neutrality. Some of that time was with Lady Vale. The pause Lucien allowed was short and unproductive. And nothing, Your Grace. I'm noting the chronology. Do I employ you to note chronology? You employ me to make sure you have information. What you do with it is, as always, your domain. Across the great hall, Seraphina had shifted her weight to her left foot, which she did when she was settling in, when she'd decided a conversation was worth the time rather than something to be politely exited. Lucien knew this. He had never once acted on this knowledge in the way of a man who finds someone worth staying near. He had filed it in the category of things he understood about her without examining why he'd noticed them at all. Leave it, Lucien said. Selwick did not argue. He was too good at his job to argue about things his employer had decided were settled. He simply moved away with the particular smooth efficiency of a man removing himself before a conclusion he'd already reached its subject. Lucien remained where he was. Kael Vorin said something else, and Seraphina's chin lifted in that way. The sharp, bright way that meant she'd been surprised into amusement, that she hadn't expected the thing to be as clever as it was. He had seen her do it reading a letter once, from a former tutor she found remarkable. He had seen it happen at the opera, once, during a passage she'd apparently not anticipated. She'd looked sideways at him then, and he'd been reading the program because the music had been going on for 40 minutes, and he had estimated it would go on for another 40, and that was information he required. She had not looked at him then with the lifted chin surprise. She was looking at Kyle Voren that way now. The sensation in his chest changed temperature. He turned his attention to the far wall, to the formal portrait of Emperor Valdris III that had hung there since before he was born. A man in full ceremonial dress looking out at a room that would outlast everything about him. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and he breathed through the thing in his chest that was not anger and not quite jealousy as he normally understood it. Not the competitive, acquisitive, strategic form that he was familiar with and could route into purpose, but something older, something that lived below strategy. He had told her she was useful. She had left. She had been gone for almost a month, and she was remarkably well. And across the gilt and marble of the imperial great hall, a prince from a rival empire was making her laugh with his whole face. Lucien Dravenmere stood very still and understood, for the first time in a life spent understanding things, that he had made an error that was not correctable by intelligence, leverage, or will. That the thing he had organized his entire domestic existence around, the absolute certainty that what he held would remain held, had turned out not to be a certainty at all. That it had been an assumption, and assumptions, as he had always told his opponents, were the architecture of defeat. The worst part was not the loss. The worst part was the particular clarity that arrived alongside it. That for 3 years he had held something worth holding, had known on some level below language that it mattered, and had never once done the work of admitting it. Not to her, not to himself, because admission had always felt like exposure, and exposure like weakness, and weakness like the beginning of the end. She had asked him a direct question, and his mind had produced useful. He stood in the great hall of the Veltharan Imperial Assembly, surrounded by the full machinery of aristocratic power that he had spent his life accumulating, and he felt, for the first time in memory, the specific cold of a man who has understood something crucial 4 weeks too late. He did not cross the room, but his eyes moved back to where she stood once, the way they would keep moving back for the rest of the evening without his entire permission. And Kyle Voren bent slightly to say something near her ear, an intimacy of proximity that was not improper but was not nothing. And Seraphina Vale, who had spent 3 years being useful in a room that had never fully looked at her, turned slightly toward him with the open, unguarded warmth of a woman who had recently remembered what it felt like to be seen. Lucien Dravenmere watched, and the empire he had built inside himself, the cold, perfect, impenetrable thing, developed in that moment, its first crack. End of part 1. He did not follow her out when the assembly ended. He walked back to Dravenmere Hall in the controlled, purposeful way that 11 years of public life had made second nature, declined his secretary's briefing summary, and went to the East Study, which was still configured exactly as it had been the morning she walked out of it. The amber light was gone by that hour. Evening now, the room lit by candelabra, the shadows doing their usual things against the bookshelves. He sat at his desk, looked at the papers that were still there, still requiring attention, still organized in the precise overlapping system that no one else understood. Thought about the way she had tilted her head, thought about the word he had chosen when she asked what she was to him. Then his secretary Varden knocked once and opened the door with the expression of a man who had evaluated the timing question extensively before proceeding. Your Grace, a beat. There is a message from the Prince Voren's embassy. He crossed the room with the sealed letter and placed it on the corner of the desk. Arrived an hour ago. It was addressed to you directly. Lucien looked at the seal, the Voren crest, deep blue wax, pressed clean. It was not, Varden hesitated, which he almost never did, the only message that arrived this hour. Lucien looked up. Lady Vale received one as well. At the Caldermere Square address. Varden's voice was perfectly neutral. Our source in the House Courier Registry noted the origin. The same seal, the same hour. Lucien sat in the silence of the East Study and looked at the blue wax crest and felt the crack in the cold empire widen by precisely 1 degree. Whatever was in that letter, Kyle Voren had sent it to both of them. And whatever it proposed, Lucien already understood that his answer was no longer the only answer that mattered. The letter sat on the corner of his desk for 40 minutes before Lucien opened it. That was unusual. He was not a man who deferred decisions. Deferral, in his experience, was just anxiety wearing the mask of strategy. But the blue wax seal sat there with a specific quality of weight that wasn't physical, and he found himself going through 3 separate documents, signing 2 of them before he acknowledged that he was not, in fact, reading them. He broke the seal. Cale Voren wrote the way he apparently did everything, with disarming directness. No courtly prologue, no ornamental phrases designed to soften the actual content into palatability. The letter was 6 lines. It proposed a meeting, not a formal diplomatic convocation, but a private one, the kind conducted without attendance and without record. The proposed location was the Meridian Club, neutral ground by convention, the city's oldest private house of conversation where no political business was technically conducted, and everyone understood political business was the only thing that happened there. The time proposed was 2 days hence. The reason given was, in Voren's own words, because you and I are going to have to understand each other, Dravenmere, and it's better to do it before the court makes the story for us. Lucien read it twice. The second time he was looking for what wasn't there, which was the more informative read. There was no mention of Seraphina. There was no need for a mention. The letter's entire subtext was her name, written in the space between every line. He set it down, picked up his pen, wrote 3 words on a response card. Tomorrow, 8 o'clock, and had Varden dispatch it before the clock struck 9. He did not sleep well. The Meridian Club occupied a narrow 4-story building on Vansborough Street that looked, from outside, like a wealthy private residence that had stopped being fashionable in the last century. Inside it smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the specific kind of quiet that money had been buying for 140 years. The staff were trained to be functionally invisible. The rooms were arranged so that conversations carried nowhere. Lucien arrived first because he always arrived first. It was the kind of small territorial claim that cost nothing and established everything. He took the corner table in the west reading room, back to the wall, sightlines to both doors, and ordered coffee and did not drink it. Cale Voren arrived 4 minutes later. In a public setting, without the ambient theater of the Imperial Assembly, he was easier to assess. He was a large man, not in the overbuilt way of soldiers who had confused mass with menace, but in the proportional, settled way of someone who had grown into his body rather than working to construct one. He dressed simply for someone of his rank. He had the easy, unhurried movement of a man who had learned that urgency was the tell of insecurity. He sat down across from Lucien without preamble, looked at the untouched coffee, and ordered his own. "You came," Cale said. "You knew I would. I knew you'd want information. Whether you'd trust the source enough to show up was less certain." He settled back in his chair. "Thank you for making it easy." "Don't mistake efficiency for ease," Lucien said. "Say what you came to say." Cale looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of attention Lucien had already clocked the previous evening. The kind that didn't compete, didn't deflect, just landed and stayed. It was, he recognized with reluctant accuracy, the look of a confident man. Not performed confidence, not the aggressive variety that required the other person's diminishment to sustain itself. The structural kind. The kind built on something internal. It was, if he was being honest, somewhat more irritating than hostility would have been. "I'm going to continue spending time with Lady Vale," Cale said. "I wanted you to hear that from me, rather than through whatever network you're running." The coffee sat between them. Lucien's jaw was level. His hands on the table were still. "She's not under my authority," Lucien said. "No, she isn't." A beat. "I wasn't asking permission." "Then what are you doing?" "Telling you the truth, which I understand may be a somewhat novel experience in your specific social ecosystem." Cale's tone was not unkind. That was the aggravating part. There was no cruelty in it, no point being driven home, just the flat delivery of a man who had decided honesty was the most efficient operating mode. "You and I are going to be in the same rooms for the next several weeks. The court is going to perform whatever narrative it finds most entertaining. I'd rather we both had accurate information going into that process." "And what information are you operating on?" Cale picked up his coffee when it arrived. Drank, set it down. that she's extraordinary, that she knows it less than she should, that whoever was responsible for that gap, a pause, brief, not unkind but not gentle either, left significant work undone. The silence had a temperature. "You've known her for 6 days," Lucien said. "5. But some things don't require long acquaintance. They require attention." He looked at Lucien steadily. "Which I understand you have. I've read your reputation thoroughly, Dravenmere. You're not a careless man and you're not stupid, which makes the alternative explanation more interesting." "What alternative explanation?" "That you knew exactly what she was worth and decided that naming it would cost you something you weren't willing to spend." Cale's voice stayed even. "And then she asked you directly, which removed the option of indefinite postponement, and you reached for the nearest safe word and handed her useful." He let that sit. "I'm not here to judge the architecture of what happened between you. I'm here because she matters to me already, which I'm aware sounds accelerated, and because you matter to this situation whether you want to or not." Lucien looked at him across the table and felt the crack from the previous evening widen by another precise degree. "What do you want from me, Vorin?" "Nothing," Kael said simply. "I want you to understand the situation clearly so that whatever happens next happens because of actual choices rather than miscalculation." He finished his coffee. "She's not going to come back because you wait her out. I want you to know that from someone who has no investment in protecting your feelings about it." He stood, left money on the table, which was unnecessary and somehow annoying in its casual adequacy. "If you decide you have something real to say to her," Kael said, looking down at Lucien with an expression that was almost irritatingly compassionate, "say it before it's too late to matter. That's not a warning, it's just information, since we're both apparently operating on that basis now." He left. Lucien sat in the Meridian Club's West Reading Room and stared at the table for longer than he had stared at anything in recent memory that wasn't a strategic document. He saw them together for the first time 3 days later. The Countess Valen's afternoon gathering was not an event he normally attended. The format was loose, the conversation largely social rather than substantive, and Lucien Dravenmere at a loose social gathering had the atmospheric effect of a structural beam in a room designed for dancing. People arranged themselves around him, stiffened, performed. He made events less themselves without meaning to. He came because Selwick had confirmed Seraphina would be there, and he had no clean story for himself about why that mattered, so he stopped trying to construct one. She was in the South Conservatory when he arrived, the light coming through the glass panels in the bright directionless way of overcast afternoons that diffuse everything evenly and make colors correct. She wore deep amber, which she almost never wore at Dravenmere Hall. She defaulted to the cooler end of the palette there, blues and greens, the colors of someone managing their visibility. The amber was not managing anything. It was just what she'd put on because it suited her. Kyle was beside her. They were looking at a painting on the far wall together, one of the Valen collection's pieces, a large landscape that Lucien had passed a dozen times without examining. They were not speaking in the moment he entered. They were just looking at the same thing at the same time in the easy, unhurried silence of two people who didn't need to fill every second with sound. The tightness in his chest arrived before the thought did. He watched for approximately 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than observation required, and then he crossed to the opposite side of the room and spoke to Lord Harwick about nothing for 10 minutes with the focused intensity of a man who needed his face occupied. Harwick, who was old and perceptive and had known Lucien since he was 22, said nothing about the direction of his eyes and accepted the conversation graciously. He did not approach her that afternoon. He approached her the following Tuesday at the Miraval Salon, which was a smaller setting and thus more honest in what proximity revealed. She was seated near the long windows when he found the angle that put him in her peripheral vision, and he watched her awareness of him arrive. The slight adjustment of posture, the fraction of stillness that moved through her before she recovered the rhythm of her conversation. And he felt something that was not satisfaction and not exactly its opposite. She knew he was there. She had always known when he was there, in every room, for 3 years. He had registered this as a natural consequence of his presence. He had not thought about what it had required from her, what it cost to be attuned to someone who wasn't attuned back. He waited until her companion moved away, and then he crossed to her, clean, direct, no performance. Seraphina. She turned. Her face did the thing he had been watching it do across multiple rooms for weeks. The brief reorganization, the settling into neutral, the choice to be present without being open. She had gotten better at it since Caldermere Square, or he had gotten better at noticing what it required. Lucien. Her voice was even, the same quality as always, the same register he had come to understand was not coolness so much as measured honesty. She did not perform gladness she didn't feel. It was one of the things about her he had catalogued without examining why he kept it. "You look well," he said, and heard 2 words in how inadequate the phrasing was. "I am well," she said, not unkindly, just accurately. They stood in the salon's light, 2 people who had shared the same household air for 3 years, and the space between them had a different quality than before. Before, it had been the space of something assumed, something ambient. She was there, he was there. The proximity was structural. Now the space had definition. It had edges. It was a gap rather than an interval. "I've been thinking," he said, and stopped, because the sentence had no safe ending that was also an honest one. Her head tilted, slightly. "About what?" The room moved around them. Conversations, movement, the particular ambient noise of gathered people. He had stood in this kind of room 1,000 times and managed it easily. Right now he was aware of only the immediate geometry. Her face, the window light, the 6 feet of defined space between them. "About whether useful was the worst word I could have chosen," he said, "or only the most honest." Something moved across her face. Not softness, not yet, maybe not soon, but the quality of someone who has heard a thing land differently than expected and is deciding what to do with the information. "And?" she said. "I don't know yet." The admission cost him something, which was how he knew it was accurate. "I know I've been running diagnostics on the last 3 years in a way I didn't perform them while they were occurring." "Diagnostics," she repeated. "It's how I think. You know that." "I do." A pause. "I spent 3 years adjusting to how you think, Lucien. I got very good at it. I could anticipate your silences, parse your shorthand, work around the places where you went cold without taking it as information about my worth." She looked at him levelly. "I did all of that because I thought eventually the distance would close, that whatever you were holding back would find an occasion to come forward." Another pause. "It didn't." "No," he said. "It didn't." "That's not a platform for something," she said. "That's just what happened." He was quiet for a moment. The room continued its indifferent ambient life around them. "Voren is," he began, "not a topic I'm going to discuss with you," she said, and the cut was clean and complete, no residual edge, just a line drawn with perfect precision. "What's between Kael and me is not relevant to whatever you and I might need to say to each other. Bringing him into this conversation is a way of not having the actual conversation." The use of the first name, he registered it the way you register a shift in ambient temperature. Physical, immediate, below thought. "You're right," he said. She looked at him. And something in the look was not the closed, organized expression of a woman managing her exposure to a previous pain. It was something more specific, curiosity, genuine, the lifted head variety he had been watching find its way toward Kael Voren across a series of rooms, and had not, until this moment, recognized as something he had let go thin in himself. "Why are you here tonight, Lucien?" she asked. The honest answer and the safe answer were not the same answer, which had always been the specific problem. "Because the rooms I'm in keep having you in them," he said, "and I keep finding I don't want to be on the side of the room where you aren't." The silence stretched between them. 8 seconds. 10. Then someone appeared at Seraphina's elbow, Lady Torvin, with the oblivious momentum of a woman who had been trying to reach her companion for several minutes, and the moment broke cleanly, the way moments do when they have been precisely what they were, and nothing more. Seraphina turned to Lady Torvin with the natural warmth she had always carried in rooms like this. That quality of easy, genuine engagement that people mistook for social grace when it was actually something more structural than that. It was interest, real and unperformed, in the people in front of her. Lucien stepped back. He crossed to the opposite side of the salon. He was still there an hour later when Kyle Voren arrived, which he had not done before at the Miraval salon. It was not his usual territory. And Lucien understood in the clean, cold way of a man processing new intelligence that the geography of Kyle Voren's movements was already beginning to map to Seraphina's. He was tracking her. Not the predatory kind of tracking, not the strategic, the kind a person does when someone has become the most interesting point in their available landscape. Lucien stood with a glass he wasn't drinking and watched Kyle cross the room to where Seraphina stood, watched the smile she gave him, the open kind, the kind that moved her whole face, the kind that meant nothing had to be translated. And the thing in his chest stopped being a crack and started being something that required different management. The confrontation in the palace gallery happened 9 days later, which was how long it took for court schedules and his own stubborn refusal to manufacture opportunity to produce one naturally. The Imperial Gallery was open on Thursday afternoons by convention, a vestigial public access tradition that mostly meant the minor nobility walked through it slowly and said things about art that were really things about each other. Lucien went because Selwick's intelligence had placed Seraphina there at 2 o'clock, and because he had spent 9 days coming up with better plans and not executing them, which meant the accidental approach was all he had left. He found her alone in the third room, standing in front of a massive oil painting, The Battle of Cadrith Crossing, 12 feet wide, rendered in the dramatic realist style of 60 years prior. It was a violent painting, all compressed motion and foreground chaos, and a sky that had turned the color of a bruise. She was looking at it with full attention, the kind she gave things she was genuinely trying to understand. He stepped into the room, and she turned, and this time there was less of the reorganization, less of the managed neutrality. She looked at him with something more direct, tired of performing maybe, or simply out of stock on the kind of energy that performance required. "You keep appearing," she said. "You keep being in places I have reason to go." "The gallery, Lucien. I have always had cultural interests." The faintest thing happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite amusement, the ghost of it. "What do you want?" He looked at the painting rather than her for a moment. The chaos of the crossing, the smoke, the horses at the forward edge caught in the mechanical violence of a battle already in progress. Men who had committed to a direction and were now in the process of discovering what commitment actually cost. "I want to understand something," he said, "about Voren." "I told you." "Not about you and him." He looked at her then. "About what he does that I didn't." The pause was long enough to have texture. "Lucien, I'm not asking to collect intelligence. I'm not going to use whatever you tell me strategically." He held her gaze. "I'm asking because I've spent most of the past month running an analysis on 3 years of proximity to you, and I keep arriving at a gap I can't identify from the inside." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light in the gallery was the indirect kind coming through high windows, the kind that fell on everything evenly and made it hard to hide behind the quality of your own illumination. "He asks questions," she said at last. "Real ones, not the social variety. He asked me last week what I would change about the current treaty framework with the southern provinces if I had authority and no political cost. Just asked. And then listened to the answer for 40 minutes without once checking whether I was taking too long. The simplicity of it landed. "I'm capable of asking questions," Lucien said. "You are. You ask excellent questions when the answers produce useful information." Her voice was still level, but something underneath it had texture now, the compression of something that had been sitting for a while and was finally being given room. "You never once asked me what I needed. You never asked what I was afraid of. You never asked what I thought about the thing I had obviously been thinking about. Because my thinking wasn't, it didn't input into anything. It didn't produce a result you were tracking." He was quiet. "I don't think you did it to be unkind," she said, and the fairness of that was somehow harder to hold than anger would have been. "I think you genuinely did not understand that a person can be fully present beside you, attending to everything about you, and still require attendance in return. I think you operated on the assumption that my proximity was self-sustaining, that it didn't need fuel." "I took you for granted," he said. "Yes." "Not deliberately." "No." That's what makes it hard to be angry about it properly. She looked back at the painting briefly, then at him. I feel safe with Kael, she said. I know that might be too direct, but you asked, and I'm going to tell you plainly. It's not that he's powerful or charming or those things are present. They're just not the point. The point is that I don't spend time near him calibrating. I don't spend energy managing my own visibility. I can say an incomplete thought and he will wait for the rest without making me feel like I'm spending credit I don't have. The words went in with the particular clean penetration of accurate things. He had done that to her. Not the dramatic cruelty of active dismissal, but the slower, more thorough variety, the kind that operates through absence, through the gap between what someone offers and what gets received, the gap that widens daily until the person standing in it is too tired to keep reaching across it. I could learn, he said. The words came out differently than he'd intended, not as a negotiating position, but as something raw, something that sounded, even to him, less like a strategy and more like a man who has just understood the specific nature of what he let go. She looked at him steadily. Maybe, she said. But Lucien, a pause, and her voice had something in it that was not cruelty but was close to honest grief. Learning takes time, and you'd be learning while Kael already knows. He had nothing to say to that, because it was true. Thus, he left the gallery before her. He walked back toward Dravenmere Hall through streets that were doing their ordinary afternoon business. People moving with the particular purposeful energy of a city that does not stop to register individual devastation. And he moved through all of it with the controlled, even pace that the world had come to read as authority. Inside, the diagnostic was running on a level below language. She had said safe. In 8 years of building the most consolidated power base in the empire, of making rooms go quiet at his entry and making opponents recalculate at his name, the word safe had never once been a thing he aspired to produce in another person. Safety was what you offered to clients, to territories, to the thing you protected in exchange for what they owed you. It was not a vocabulary he had thought to apply to the space between two people in a room. And yet, she had stood in front of a painting of a historical battle and told him that the thing she valued most, the thing that another man had produced in her with apparent ease, was peace. The simple structural peace of not having to manage herself in the presence of someone she wanted to be near. He had been, for 3 years, so comprehensively himself, so committed to the architecture of what he was and how it functioned, that he had never once asked whether the architecture was hospitable. He arrived at Dravenmere Hall and went to the East Study by habit, and stood in the middle of it for a moment, looking at the desk, the papers, the particular amber light that the season was already beginning to pull away from. The room looked exactly like itself. It looked, for the first time, like something designed entirely for one person. The announcement came on a Friday. Not through the social circuit, not through the slow, permeable membrane of court gossip, through the formal channel of the Imperial Herald's office, which meant it was official, which meant it had been filed and reviewed, which meant it was not a negotiating position or a social maneuver. Prince Kael Vorn of the Voran Empire intended to formally petition the Imperial Court of Veltharn for the right to court Lady Seraphina Vale with intent toward a marriage proposal, subject to her family's approval and her own consent. The petition was procedurally unnecessary. She was a free woman of independent means, and the right to court her required no imperial sanction. The filing was a statement. It was Kael telling the entire court, the entire nobility, the entire established social structure of the empire. I am serious. It is public. And I am not apologizing for either. Lucien read the document in his study at 8 in the morning. He read it 3 times. The 3rd time he was no longer reading the words. He was sitting in the particular silence of a man who has just understood that the situation has outpaced his management of it. That while he was running diagnostics and attending salons and finding the honest words in the gallery, the timeline had been moving on its own schedule, indifferent to his pace of processing. She had said, "Learning takes time," and Kael already knows. The Herald's document sat on his desk. His hands were still. His breathing was controlled. From the outside, by any observer who had ever watched Lucien Dravenmere receive difficult information, he looked exactly as he always looked, composed, calculating, unreadable. But the thing in his chest that had been a crack for weeks had spread to every wall. And somewhere in the city, in a townhouse near Caldermere Square, Seraphina Vale had received the same document and was deciding, in the freedom of her own undirected time, in the peace of a room where no one required management, what her answer was going to be. He had no move left that was also a safe move. He had only the move that was true. He gave himself 1 hour. That was the duration he allowed for the specific paralysis that had settled into him after reading the Herald's document. Not grief exactly, not rage, but the cold, pressurized stillness of a man who has built his entire operational existence on the premise that information plus will equals outcome, and has just received evidence that the equation has a variable he forgot to account for. He sat in the East study and let the hour run. He did not perform productivity. He did not reach for documents he wouldn't read. He simply sat with the particular weight of a situation that had moved beyond his management while he was still believing he was managing it. Then the hour ended, and he stood up. He needed Selwick. Plus, Selwick arrived within 12 minutes of the summons, which meant he had been close, which meant he had been anticipating the summons. This, in the lexicon of their 11 years together, was communication. Selwick appeared in the East study doorway with the carefully neutral face of a man who has already processed the morning's information and is waiting to find out which version of his employer he is dealing with. "You saw the filing," Lucien said. "This morning, yes." "Tell me what you know about it. Not what I can read from the document. What you know." Selwick crossed to the chair across from the desk and sat without being invited, which he only did when he had something that required the posture of a direct conversation rather than a briefing. Lucien registered this and waited. "The petition was filed 3 days ago," Selwick said. "The public announcement this morning was coordinated with it, but the document itself went through the Imperial Herald's registry on Tuesday." A pause. "Someone in your household knew about the filing before it became public." The room temperature did not change. Lucien's expression did not change. But something in his chest that had already been running through its architecture of damage did a specific, quiet recalculation. "How long have you known this?" he said. "I confirmed it last night." Selwick's voice was even, the practiced neutrality of a man delivering news he did not want to deliver. "I've been pulling threads for 2 weeks, since the Voran embassy arrival. There were details reaching Voran's people about your movements, your schedule, the specific occasions on which you and Lady Vale were likely to be in proximity." He stopped. "Go on." "The information was accurate enough to be sourced from inside this house." Selwick looked at him with the steadiness of a man who had decided the only available good option was complete honesty. "I narrowed it to 3 people with the access and the opportunity, then to 2, then to 1. "Who?" "1 word, flat." The specific flatness that Lucien produced when the thing requiring management was very large and the control required to manage it was costing him considerably. Selwick said the name. The silence afterward had a different quality than all the silences before it in this room. It was not the silence of a man calculating. It was the silence of a man absorbing the specific shock of a betrayal that the mind, in its optimistic residual way, keeps insisting is impossible until the evidence no longer permits the insistence. Aldrich Vane. Aldrich Vane, who had been Lucien's chief household steward for 7 years, who had managed the internal correspondence of Dravenmere Hall with the quiet, comprehensive efficiency of someone who had made himself architecturally essential, who knew the layout of every schedule, every engagement, every private exchange that passed through the household's daily operations, who had been, in the specific way of trusted subordinates who outlast the testing period and become furniture, essentially invisible in the way that only the most dangerous informants ever are. Lucien looked at the wall above Selwick's head for approximately 4 seconds. Then he said, very quietly, "Bring him to me." Aldrich Vane was a slight man of 51, with the kind of composed, service-trained face that had always read as professional discretion and now read as something considerably colder. He entered the East study 20 minutes later with the habitual forward tilt of a man who has spent decades in the physical grammar of deference. And when he saw Selwick standing to the side and registered the quality of Lucien's stillness behind the desk, something in his face performed a rapid internal adjustment that was not quite panic but was adjacent to it. "Your Grace," he said, "sit down." Vane sat. He had been doing this for 7 years, sitting in this room when called, producing information, receiving instructions, maintaining the smooth operational continuity of a household that ran like a closed system because he had made himself the mechanism of its running. He had been trusted here. He had been so thoroughly trusted that Lucien had never once looked directly at him with the evaluative attention he gave everything else, because trust of the architectural kind operates below scrutiny. That, Lucien understood now, with the cold precision of a man processing the specific mechanics of how he had been used, had been the exploit. "The Vorin Embassy," Lucien said. "How long?" Vane looked at the desk between them. He was doing arithmetic behind his eyes, the particular calculation of a man deciding whether the version of the story that keeps him safest is also the version he can make credible. "Your Grace, I'm not certain what. Aldrich." The name came out with a precise weight, not raised, not hot, not the theatrical variety of anger that needed volume to communicate itself. The flat, cold kind, the kind that had cleared rooms and ended careers and made people understand, without ambiguity, that the person producing it was not operating with excess emotions getting in the way of outcome. "I have 14 years of intelligence work running through my network. I have Selwick, who has been doing this since before you were in my employ. I have specific documentation that I will lay on this desk if the conversation requires it. What I am asking you for is the version where you decide to tell me the truth before I demonstrate how entirely unnecessary your cooperation actually is." Vane looked at him. Then something in the composed, service-trained face came apart. Not dramatically, not with tears or volume, but in the specific quiet way of a structure that has been under load longer than it was designed to carry, and finally, simply settles. 8 weeks, he said. 8 weeks. Before the Vorin Embassy's arrival. Before the diplomatic visit was public knowledge. Someone had been building the channel while Lucien was still filing the briefing document in the minor priority stack of his weekly correspondence. "He made contact through an intermediary," Vane said, his voice acquiring the particular flat quality of a man who has decided that confession is now the only operational mode. "Not Vorin directly. A merchant with connections to the Vorin trade envoys. The initial approach was indirect, information about your schedule, your public movements, nothing sensitive. And then it became more specific." Vane looked at the desk. "Your private engagements, the occasions when you were likely to encounter Lady Vale, the state of a pause, the state of things between you." The thing in Lucien's chest went very still, the kind of still that is not calm. "He needed to know where the openings were," Lucien said. "Yes. He needed to know when I was absent, when she was unaccompanied, when the field was available." Vane said nothing because the silence was the answer. Lucien stood. He moved to the window, the east-facing one, his back to the room because the alternative was remaining at the desk with a proximity to Aldrich Vane that his self-possession was not, in this precise moment, fully equipped to manage. He stood and looked at the morning and breathed through the thing that was moving through him, which was not grief and not rage in the clean, separate forms he would have preferred, but some compound of both that had no clean name and required careful handling. He had been outmaneuvered. Not in the territory he monitored, not in the domains where his attention had been concentrated and his defenses built over years of deliberate construction, but in the specific soft space of his private life, the space he had never thought to armor because it had never occurred to him that it was a space worth attacking. A man who kept his personal life thin keeps fewer vulnerabilities there. He had been so comprehensively organized in his professional domain that he had simply not expected anyone to find purchase in the domestic one. And Aldrich Vane had been in that domestic space for 7 years. 7 years of schedules and correspondence and the quiet accumulated architecture of daily access. And he had turned it over, methodically, piece by piece, to a prince from a rival empire who was using the information not for political leverage, not for anything so clean and manageable as geopolitical strategy, but to know where Seraphina would be, when she would be alone. When Lucien's absence from her orbit created room for someone else to move into it, he turned back to the room. "Why?" he said. Vane looked up at him. And the answer that came across the man's face before the words did was the one Lucien least wanted and had already suspected. It was not ideology, not political conviction, not the clean motive of a man who believed in a different future. It was money. The oldest and least interesting reason for everything, the one that required no complex psychology to explain, just the ordinary human mathematics of someone who had calculated his own value against his own needs and found the exchange rate acceptable. The amount, Vane said, was significant. Lucien looked at him for a long moment. Then he said to Selwick, without moving his eyes, "Remove him from the house. The appropriate authorities will be notified. Make sure the documentation is complete before anything is filed." Selwick moved. Vane stood, with the diminished, somehow smaller posture of a man who has just been reduced from a functioning entity to a problem being processed, and was guided from the room. The East study went quiet. Lucien sat down at his desk. He had been betrayed before. That was not a new category of experience. 11 years of building power in an environment where power attracted exactly the people who wanted to dismantle it guaranteed periodic betrayal, and he had developed the specific emotional callus that came from processing it efficiently and routing the residual anger into corrective action. Betrayal was information. Information was resource. He had run this equation successfully for over a decade. What was different about this one was the location of the wound. It was not his finances, not his political standing, not any of the external structures he had spent his adult life constructing. It was the one interior space he had never thought to examine carefully, the space where Seraphina had been, quietly, for 3 years, while he was looking everywhere else. Kyle Voren had not won her through superior force or superior strategy. He had won access to the field through money paid to a household steward who had watched Lucien fail to treat the most significant presence in his domestic life as significant enough to protect. That was the full accounting. He had not been outmaneuvered by a brilliant opponent. He had been outmaneuvered by his own assumption that what he held did not require the care of holding. The Imperial War Chamber was not a room that accommodated ambiguity. It occupied the northeast wing of the palace's administrative complex. 22 feet of ceiling, maps on every wall, the long central table built wide enough that the men sitting across it could not reach each other, which was, presumably, the point. It was a room designed for the management of force, for the conversion of political complexity into actionable terms. Lucien had sat in it many times. He had always found it clarifying. He requested the meeting with Voren through official channels, which meant it was documented, which meant both of them understood it had a formal character that the Meridian Club meeting had not. It meant the next conversation would be witnessed by at least some record of itself. Voren arrived with 2 of his embassy staff, who took positions near the door with the practiced neutrality of men who understood their role was to be present rather than participatory. Lucien had Selwick. They sat across the long table from each other. "You know why you're here," Lucien said. Voren looked at him with the same settled, undefensive attention he had produced at the Meridian Club. "I have a reasonable assumption, yes. My household steward, 7 weeks of access, my schedule, my movements, my—" Lucien stopped on the next word, which was her name, and rerouted. "My private circumstances." Voren's expression did not fracture or deflect, but something in it changed register, moved from the composed to the serious the way a face does when it has been expecting a conversation to arrive and is now handling its actual weight. "I was aware that an approach had been made," he said. "I was not involved in the specifics of it. But you used what it produced." A pause. "I knew your schedule more accurately than I should have." "Yes." He held Lucien's gaze. "I won't construct a defense for that. It was an intelligence advantage, and I accepted the benefit of it." The honesty was, as it had been at the Meridian Club, the most aggravating available response. "You paid a man in my house," Lucien said, "to map the geography of my absence." "I paid for information. What that information indicated about your habits, The gaps in your attention to things that mattered, that was not manufactured, it was observed. The silence between them had a different quality than their previous silence. This one had load-bearing walls. She doesn't know, Lucien said. No. And if she finds out, it would hurt her, Vorin said plainly, and the plainness of it was not strategic, just accurate. Not because of what I did, because of what it reveals about how much space existed to do it in. He looked at Lucien with something that was not victory and not compassion exactly, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. You want to use this as a weapon. I understand that impulse. I want you to consider what it costs. What it costs me. What it costs her. Vorin leaned forward slightly, his elbows on the table, the posture of a man who has stopped performing and is just talking. She is the person at the center of this. Not you, not me, not our respective interests or wounded pride or strategic calculations. She is the person whose next several months get determined by what happens in this room and the rooms after it. His voice stayed level. You can expose what I did. You will damage my standing with her and possibly beyond repair, and she will spend the rest of this year knowing that the two men she was navigating between were both, in their respective ways, treating her as a terrain to be managed rather than a person to be asked. Lucien looked at him. The war chamber's maps covered every wall around them. Territories, borders, the cartography of claimed and contested space, all the organized geography of the world that human ambition had been sorting and resorting for centuries. He had spent his life in rooms like this, understanding the world as a problem of position and resource and will. Seraphina had told him she felt safe with Kael. Standing in a gallery with complete, honest patience, she had told him the thing she needed most was to not spend energy calibrating herself in the presence of someone she wanted to be near. And here he sat in the war chamber, running the same exact calculation he always ran: how to use the information, how to weaponize the position, how to convert the discovery into advantage, and feeling with nauseating precision the specific way in which running that calculation was the exact proof of her point. He could expose Vorin. He could do it cleanly, with documentation, in front of the right people, and watch the man's credibility with her crumble under the weight of it. And she would be free of Vorin. And she would look at Lucien, after, and see a man who had found a lever and used it. Not a man who had changed, a man who had found a smarter way to be exactly what he already was. The thing in his chest did something he did not have a word for. It was not breaking. It was something more like the specific pain of a door opening in a wall you had bricked up so long ago you had stopped remembering it was a door. He looked at Kael Vorin across the length of the war chamber table. You love her, Lucien said. Not a question. Vorin looked back at him without flinching. Yes. And you still paid my steward. And I still paid your steward. No deflection, no softening. I wanted the field. I used a method I'm not proud of. Both things are true. The honesty was again insufferable. Lucien sat in it for a long moment. The maps watched from all four walls. The two embassy staff were still at the door. Selwick was somewhere behind him with the careful neutrality of a man who would not influence this particular decision and knew it. I'm not going to expose you, Lucien said finally. Vorin's expression shifted. Not relief, something more complicated. Because it would hurt her, Lucien continued, not for any other reason. Not because I'm extending you a courtesy and not because I've decided you're right. Because she has been managed enough by both of us, and I am not going to add another layer to that. A long beat. But understand this. He looked at Vorin with everything he was. Not the performance of it, not the managed version, but the full weight of a man who had spent his life ensuring that the people across from him understood exactly where the lines were. I'm going to say something to her, something true and without strategy, and then she is going to decide. His voice was level. Whatever she decides, I will accept. But the decision is going to be made on honest ground, without your intelligence operation in the soil underneath it. Vorin looked at him. Then, for the first time in either of their encounters, he nodded. Not submission, not defeat, just the acknowledgement of one man to another that the terms were fair. Lucien walked out of the imperial war chamber into the gray afternoon and stood at the top of the palace steps for a moment, feeling the cold air come off the city in its ordinary late autumn way, the smell of coal smoke and river water, and the damp particular smell of a capital that has been occupied for 800 years and carries the layered residue of all of it. He had nothing left to hide behind. No intelligence advantage, no strategic position, no architecture of accumulated power that would make the next conversation anything other than what it was. A man who had been given the truth about himself, repeatedly and patiently, and at considerable cost to the person delivering it, going to find out if he had understood it late enough that it no longer mattered. The carriage was waiting. He did not get into it. He walked. Caldermere Square was 20 minutes on foot, and he used all 20 of them for the specific and unfamiliar work of not preparing what he would say. He had spent his entire adult life preparing what he would say. He had the pre-positioned response, the considered formulation, the layered construction that revealed exactly what he wanted to reveal at exactly the strategic moment. He was going to walk through the door of whatever this was without any of that. Somewhere across the city, in the townhouse near Caldermere Square, Seraphina Vale was doing whatever she did on Thursday afternoons when the world had not yet delivered the next crisis. Probably reading, probably with the quality of settled concentration she brought to things she actually wanted, rather than things she was accommodating. He was going to arrive in her life not as the Duke of Dravenmere, not as the most powerful unelected man in the empire, not as a figure that rooms reorganized themselves around, just as a man who had understood something too late and needed her to know that the understanding, at least, was real. He turned onto Caldermere Street. He had taken approximately 40 steps when the second carriage passed him, the deep blue of the Vorin embassy livery, heading in the same direction. He stopped, watched it. Vorin's carriage, moving toward Caldermere Square with the unhurried pace of a vehicle that has a destination and no reason to rush toward it. He had told Vorin the decision would be made on honest ground. He had not accounted for the possibility that Vorin, having agreed to fair terms, would immediately move to reach her first. The cold came off the cobblestones. The carriage rounded the corner and disappeared. Lucien stood in the empty street with the full weight of what he had not said in 3 years, in both hands, with nowhere left to set it down. And for the first time in his life, the most feared man in the empire began to run. He had not run since he was 19 years old. That was the last time his body had moved faster than dignity permitted. A training exercise in the Dravenmere northern grounds, before the title was fully his, before the weight of it had settled into his posture and made certain physical expressions feel like concessions. He had been fast then. He had been a lot of things then that the subsequent years had organized out of him in the name of becoming someone who did not need to run because things came to him. He ran now. Not full sprint. The cobblestones were uneven. The street was occupied with afternoon foot traffic, and a Duke of the Empire running flat out through Caldermere was information he could not afford to distribute. But the controlled, hard-paced stride of a man covering ground faster than walking, while still technically maintaining the form of someone with a destination rather than a desperation. His coat was wrong for it. His boots were wrong for it. His lungs, which had spent the last several years being consulted only for the measured breathing of a man who sat at desks and stood in rooms and never asked them to do very much, registered a sharp complaint around the third intersection. He did not slow. The Vorin carriage had a 2-minute lead and a horse. He had legs and the knowledge that Caldermere Square had 2 approaches, and if he cut through Merchant's Lane and came in from the south side, he would reach the Vale Townhouse's front steps before the carriage completed the longer avenue approach from the north. He cut through Merchant's Lane. The narrow passage was crowded with late afternoon commerce, crates, a cart, 3 men having an argument that required the full width of the alley. He moved through it with the focused, specific efficiency of a man who has stopped caring what he looks like and started caring only about what happens next. A shoulder clipped a wooden post. A woman with a basket pressed herself against the wall with an expression of startled indignation. He emerged onto the south approach of Caldermere Square, and the townhouse was 20 yards ahead. The Vorin carriage was rounding the north corner. He had perhaps 40 seconds. He was at the front steps when the door opened. Not because he knocked. He had not yet knocked, had not yet organized the fundamental question of how a man who has spent 3 years withholding himself announces himself at a door he does not own. But because Seraphina's maid, Dora, had apparently been at the front window and had watched the Duke of Dravenmere cover the last 50 yards of Caldermere in a way that required immediate investigation. Dora stood in the doorway with the careful assessor's expression of a woman who has been managing her employer's privacy for 2 years and takes the responsibility seriously. "Your Grace," she said, with the precise neutrality of someone deciding. "I need to speak with Lady Vale," he said. He could hear his own breath. He almost never heard his own breath. Dora looked past him at the Voren carriage now completing its turn into the square. Then she looked back at him with the kind of crisp, unsentimental judgment that good staff made look effortless. She stepped aside. "Drawing room," she said. "I'll tell her you're here." He went in. The Vale townhouse was nothing like Dravenmere Hall, which was the first thing he registered in the particular heightened clarity way of a man whose body was still processing the run while his mind was attempting to organize the conversation ahead. It was smaller, much smaller, but not in the way of insufficiency, in the way of intention. The rooms were chosen rather than accumulated. The proportions felt human rather than architectural. There were books on the side table in the drawing room that were actually being read, spines cracked and pages soft with handling, not arranged for the impression of scholarship. A throw on the armchair that had been used and left in the natural disarray of actual occupation. She lived here. Not as a guest, not in the careful, self-minimizing way she had occupied the suite at Dravenmere Hall, the way he now understood, with the retrospective clarity of a man who has finally looked at a thing he was avoiding. She had always moved through his space, precisely, gracefully, making herself as unobtrusive as possible in a house that had never fully told her she belonged in it. She lived here as someone who occupied space on her own terms. He was still holding this thought when she came in. She wore a pale gray day dress, her hair half pinned and half loose in the way of an afternoon at home, rather than an afternoon performing home. And she looked at him in the doorway with the specific expression of a woman who has been delivered unexpected information and is processing it while it is still in front of her. "You ran," she said. The maid had clearly mentioned this. "Yes," he said. A beat. "Are you all right?" "No," he said. "I'm going to need you to give me a minute." She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not softness, not yet, but the quality of someone who has just seen something they did not expect and is adjusting the frame they were using to organize the situation. She sat down. He did not sit. He stood in the middle of the drawing room with his coat still on and his breathing still somewhat elevated, and he looked at her and understood that everything he had been rehearsing on the walk from the palace, the shaped, considered, strategic version of honesty that was still honesty but was also managed, also positioned, also the product of a man who, even in his most vulnerable moments, was still running the architecture of the impression he produced, needed to be set down. All of it. "I found out today," he said, "that Voren's people had a source inside my household, someone who had been passing information for 8 weeks. Your movements, my schedule, the specific shape of the space between us." He watched her face process this. "I'm telling you because you should know it, not because I want to use it. I've already decided not to go public with it. That's not why I'm here." Her expression had gone very still. "Kael knew," she said. Not a question. The mind working, rapid, behind level eyes. "He was aware of it, yes. He says he didn't direct the specifics." The stillness held for a moment. Then something shifted in it. Not collapse, not the theatrical devastation he might have expected, but the particular quiet of a woman absorbing information that recontextualizes something she had felt good about, and doing it without the luxury of having someone to be simply, cleanly angry at, because nothing about it was simple or clean. "That's why you ran," she said. "Partly." "What's the other part?" He looked at her. The room around them was the specific warm gray of an autumn afternoon indoors, the kind of light that had no agenda, that just fell on whatever was in front of it without comment. He had spent 3 years in rooms lit by the cold architectural precision of Dravenmere's high windows, where everything looked like evidence and nothing looked like home. "I owe you a different conversation than the one I've been having with you," he said. "Every time we've spoken in the last month, I've been running a version of the thing I do, saying something true but shaped, finding the angle that's honest but also positions me in the territory I want to occupy." He paused. "You called it in the gallery. You said I was doing the thing where I found a formulation that sounds like an answer and isn't one. I've been doing that, even when I was trying not to." She was watching him with her full attention, which was the kind of attention that had no mercy in it. Not because it was unkind, but because it was complete, because it saw what was there and did not negotiate with what was more comfortable. "So say the unformulated version," she said. The knock at the front door came precisely then, which was either catastrophic timing or the universe demonstrating its comprehensive indifference to personal drama. They both heard it. They both knew what it was. He watched her look toward the hallway, watched the small, complex thing that moved across her face, not the open warmth she gave Voren in public, but something more private, more conflicted, the expression of a woman who has been navigating between two gravitational fields for weeks and is exhausted by the navigation. "He can wait," she said. He looked at her. "He can wait," she repeated, and her voice was quieter this time, not for Voren's benefit, but for some internal reckoning, some decision she was making in real time about what she owed which person in which order. "Say what you came to say, Lucien. Before I lose the version of this, that's just us." He sat down then. Across from her, no table between them, the armchairs angled with the natural geometry of a room where two people sometimes sat and talked to each other rather than at each other. "I've been running diagnostics on myself," he said, "the way I do on everything. Trying to identify the structural failure, trying to find the specific point where the error occurred so I can understand how to correct it." He looked at his own hands for a moment, then back at her. "And I keep arriving at the same place, which is that there wasn't a specific point. The error was the whole architecture. I built my entire interior life, if I have one, on the premise that nearness was a form of care, that presence was the same as attention, that the fact of you being in my daily life was something I was offering rather than something I was receiving while offering nothing in return." She was quiet. "I told you were useful," he said, "because in the moment you asked the question, the honest answer was what my mind reached for first, and my mind, at that point, had categorized everything in my life by its function. You were the most valuable thing in my daily existence, and I had stored that value in the folder labeled useful because I did not have a folder that held anything else." A pause. "That is not a defense. It's the diagnosis." "I know the difference," she said softly. "I know you do." He looked at her and let himself do what he had been not doing for weeks in every room they'd occupied together. He looked at her without the management of it, without the calibration, without the strategic deployment of eye contact as a tool for controlling the quality of an exchange. He just looked at her, the way she had looked at things she found worth standing in front of. "You are not useful to me. You are—" He stopped on the word, and the stop was not strategy. It was the specific difficulty of a man saying something out loud for the first time that his entire system had been running silently for years. Necessary. In a way that has nothing to do with function, in a way I have no efficient language for because I have spent my entire adult life actively not developing the language for it. The drawing room held the quiet. "Lucien, I'm not finished." Not sharp, just direct. The same quality he brought to rooms where the truth needed to reach the other side without obstruction. "I watched you in the Imperial Assembly and felt something I didn't have a word for. I sat in the Meridian Club across from Voren and heard him describe what he gives you, and understood that I had possessed the same capability and never once deployed it, not because I lacked it, but because I had decided, somewhere very early, that letting someone know they mattered to you was the specific kind of exposure that turned you into a target." His voice stayed level. It cost him. "I don't want to possess you. I never wanted to. I just operated as though I did, because possession was a category I understood, and what I actually felt was in a category I'd never mapped." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "What category is it?" "The one," he said, "where you want someone to be well. Not because their wellness serves your interests, not because their presence provides you something you require. Just, you want them to be all right, in rooms you're not in, on days you don't see them, in the life they would live if you had never been any part of it." He exhaled once, the single controlled concession to the effort of saying things he had never said. "I want that for you. I think I have wanted it for longer than I can accurately date. And I spent 3 years in a house with you and never once said it, because saying it required me to be the kind of man I hadn't decided to be yet." The afternoon light sat on everything evenly. From the hallway came the quiet sound of the front door. Dora presumably explaining to Kyle Voren's representative that Lady Vale was currently occupied. The sound of it was very ordinary. The entire situation was, in its way, very ordinary. 2 people in a drawing room, an autumn afternoon, the specific and unremarkable theater of 2 people trying to figure out whether what was between them was alive. "You understand," Seraphina said carefully, "that I need to think about what Kyle knew, about the intelligence operation." "Yes. And that this conversation, what you just said, I'm going to need time with it. It doesn't resolve everything by being true." "I know. And you're all right with that." He looked at her steadily. "I don't have a choice about being all right with it. You get to take whatever time you need. That's not me being gracious. That's just how it works when you actually care about what another person decides rather than what result you want them to produce." The faintest thing moved across her face. The ghost of the lifted chin surprise, there and gone. He left before Voren came in. Not because he was asked to, but because he understood, with the particular clarity that the last several hours had stripped him down to, that his presence during whatever conversation she was about to have with Kyle was a form of pressure he was not entitled to apply. She needed the room without him in it. He needed to have left the room having said what he came to say, without remaining to watch what she did with it. He walked down the front steps of the Vale townhouse, onto Caldermere Square's even cobblestones, and the late afternoon was doing its ordinary things: pigeons, the smell of cook fires from the houses along the south side, the particular ambient sound of a city moving through its daily operations with complete indifference to individual consequence. Kyle Voren was at the bottom of the steps, not in the carriage. Standing beside it, coat collar turned up against the autumn chill, watching Lucien come down with the settled, measuring attention that had characterized every exchange between them. Behind him, his driver and his 2 staff waited in the careful stillness of people who understood their job was to occupy space without contributing to it. They looked at each other. "She knows," Lucien said. Something moved across Voren's face. Not surprise. The acknowledgement of something he had been holding the weight of. "I thought you decided not to use it." "I decided not to use it as a weapon," Lucien said. "Telling her the truth is not a weapon. It's the least I owed her." He looked at Voren in the flat, direct way he'd looked at things his entire life. The assessment without embellishment, the reading without the interference of what he wished the reading would produce. "She's going to have to decide what it means. For you. That's between you and her." Voren was quiet for a moment, then, "And what you said to her, what was that?" "That's between her and me." A long beat. The square moved around them, indifferent. "You know," Voren said, and his voice had lost the smooth, composed quality, and had something raw underneath it, the sound of a man who is also tired of performing his own certainty. "I have been very clear with myself about what I want. I am less clear about whether what I want and what she needs are the same thing." He looked at Lucien. "I told her I loved her, last week. She didn't say it back." The information landed. Lucien held it. "She said she needed time," Voren continued. "I accepted that. I understood it. I filed it as process rather than answer." His jaw was level. But a man who is honest with himself looks at what he did with the intelligence access and understands that telling someone you love them while having spent 8 weeks mapping their life without their knowledge, those 2 things are not reconcilable into a clean story. "No," Lucien said, "they're not." "So," Voren looked at him, "we're both going to find out what she decides." Yes. And if she... He stopped. The first genuine stop. The first place in any of their conversations where the composure had reached its limit and the thing underneath it was visible for a moment before being recontained. If she chooses you, I need you to know that I will accept it, because I meant what I said in the war chamber. Her happiness is the point. Lucien looked at him for a long moment. Then he said the only accurate thing. If she chooses you, I'll need to find out whether I'm capable of the same. It was the most honest sentence he had said to another man in memory. Voren looked at him with something that, in a different world, a different year, might have been the beginning of respect. Then he walked up the steps. The Imperial Ascension Banquet invitation arrived at Dravenmere Hall the following morning. Lucien received it at the East Study desk, in the amber light, with the house around him running its ordinary operations in the changed quiet of a household that had processed one departure and the removal of a trusted steward in the same season and had not yet found its new equilibrium. He read the invitation with the focused attention of a man reading everything carefully now, because he had recently learned the cost of reading selectively. The Ascension Banquet was the Empire's most formal annual occasion. Every significant noble, military figure, and visiting dignitary and residents would be present. Emperor Valdris himself presided. It was the kind of event that had no private corners. It was all public, all witnessed, all running on the formal register of a society that had spent 800 years codifying the meaning of public gesture. Kyle Voren would be there. Seraphina would be there. He would be there. He set the invitation down on the desk. He had spent his entire life understanding that public occasions were the real political battlefield, that the private meetings mattered less in the end than what was said in rooms full of witnesses, because witnesses made things permanent in a way that private conversation never did. He had used this understanding aggressively for a decade. He knew exactly how the theater of public position worked. He also understood, sitting in the East Study with the amber light doing its ordinary thing and the house quiet around him, that the thing he needed to do at the Ascension Banquet was the single action his entire system had been built to prevent. He needed to stand in a room full of generals and nobles and the supreme authority of the Empire and be, without qualification or management or strategic positioning, the most exposed version of himself that had ever appeared in public. Not because it was tactically sound, not because it would win anything, but because Seraphina Vale had spent 3 years being asked, in every way except the direct one, to accept the managed version of him as the whole of him. And she deserved, before she made whatever decision she was in the process of making, to see the whole of him, publicly, permanently, in a room full of witnesses who would remember it regardless of outcome. He looked at the invitation. He had one evening to decide whether he was capable of it. One evening to find out whether the man he had spent the last month becoming, in increments, in the specific slow work of understanding what he'd failed at, whether that man could do the thing the other man never could. Walk into the most watched room in the Empire with nothing in front of him, bombed. The Ascension Banquet occupied the Imperial Palace's Great Hall in the full formal register of the occasion. 700 candles, the long tables set with the imperial silver, the musicians arranged in the upper gallery with the particular repertoire of a night that had been running the same form for generations. The hall smelled of warm wax and winter flowers, and the particular collective warmth of 200 bodies in formal dress occupying a room that was designed to make them feel appropriately small before the scale of the institution they served. Lucien arrived on time, which at events like this meant he arrived with the main body rather than early enough to select position or late enough to make an entrance. He wore his formal ducal dress and carried none of the operational energy he normally brought to rooms like this, the active, scanning, field-assessing quality that made people give him space as a matter of self-preservation. He looked, to the people who glanced his way in the first 20 minutes, like himself but quieter, like a frequency that had been turned slightly down from its normal amplitude. He found her at the east side of the room before the formal seating, standing with Lady Torvin and Lord Miraval, in deep blue with her hair fully arranged, the public version of her that was composed and gracious and completely present in whatever conversation was happening in front of her. She looked, as Selwick had reported in the far more irritating context of 2 months ago, remarkably well. Kyle Voren was across the room, in conversation with two of the Emperor's military advisors, close enough to be visible to her and not close enough to be beside her, a distance that had the quality of a choice rather than a circumstance. The formal seating began at 7. He was 3 positions down the table from her, with a foreign trade minister and a military general between them, which was enough distance that conversation required intention rather than proximity. He looked at her twice during the first course, and both times she was looking somewhere else, and he did not create the eye contact because forcing it across a formal table was the kind of management he had decided to stop doing. He ate approximately none of the first course. The Emperor's address came between the third and fourth courses, as it always did. 15 minutes of the formal, considered language of a man who understood that public occasions required their rituals to feel legitimate, and Valdris performed his rituals with the thoughtful precision of someone who had been doing them for 23 years. Lucien listened with the surface of his attention while the rest of him was doing something he had almost no practice at, which was sitting inside a decision rather than executing it. He had decided what he was going to do. He was going to stand. In the specific tradition of Ascension banquets, the floor was opened after the Emperor's address for formal declarations, political announcements, alliance confirmations, honors bestowed. It was a parliamentary tradition 3 centuries old. It had been used most recently, in this hall, for territorial boundary confirmations and trade treaty ratifications. He was going to stand and say something that had no political content. He was going to stand in the most formally witnessed room in the Empire and say something true about himself that could not be recalled, retracted, or managed after the fact. And he was going to do it not as a maneuver and not as a performance, and not as the strategic deployment of vulnerability for a desired outcome, but because she had asked him, in a drawing room in Caldermere Square, in a voice that was quiet and precise, what he would say if he said the unformulated version. He was about to answer. The Emperor concluded his address. The room held its formal, attentive silence as Valdris raised his glass, and the ritual acknowledgement moved around the table in its practiced wave. And Lucien Dravenmere, in the held breath after the Emperor sat, before anyone else in the room could move to fill the space, pushed back his chair. He stood. The room's attention swung to him with the immediate, reflexive precision of 200 people who had spent their careers learning to track whoever was currently occupying the most significant position in any given space. Generals, nobles, ministers, foreign dignitaries, the staff along the walls, all of it aligned to him with the gravity that had followed him his entire adult life. He had spent that adult life knowing how to use this. He looked down the table, past the trade minister and the general, and the empty gesture of the formal seating arrangement, to where Seraphina Vale sat very still with her glass in her hand and her eyes on him with the specific quality of someone who does not yet know what is about to happen. He looked at her. And the most feared man in the Empire, standing in the most watched room in the Empire, with 200 witnesses and 1 emperor and his entire reputation operating as the live stakes of the next 90 seconds, opened his mouth. The room did not breathe. That was the only way to describe it. 200 people suspended in the particular collective stillness of an audience that has just understood it is witnessing something outside the formal script, something that has not been coordinated with the protocol officers or cleared through the Imperial Secretary's office, something that is happening because a man decided it would happen and the only architecture supporting it is whatever he is made of underneath the title. Lucien stood at the long table in the candlelight and looked at Seraphina Vale and let the silence run for exactly 3 seconds. Not for effect, not as the strategic deployment of pause that he had spent years perfecting, but because his chest had the specific compressed quality of a man standing at the edge of something irreversible and taking one last breath before the step. Then he spoke. "I have spent 11 years in rooms like this one," he said, making sure that everything I said served a purpose I had identified in advance, every word positioned, every concession calculated, every display of strength timed for maximum effect. His voice carried in the formal hall the way voices did when they had the room's full attention and did not need to reach for volume. I was very good at it. I am, in fact, still very good at it, which is precisely why I need you all to understand that what I am about to say is not that. The emperor sat at the head of the table with the particular stillness of a man who has presided over enough human complexity to recognize genuine departure from form when it arrives. He did not intervene. He watched. "I made an error," Lucien said. "Not a political error, not a strategic one, the kind that doesn't show up in any ledger and doesn't get corrected by any amount of intelligence or will. I had beside me, for 3 years, a woman of exceptional quality. Not exceptional in the way that courts use the word, not as a social ornament or a political asset, but genuinely structurally exceptional in the way of someone whose presence makes the rooms they occupy more honest, and I treated her as something I had rather than someone I was accountable to." He did not look away from Seraphina. "I told her she was useful to me. I said it because it was accurate, and because accurate was the closest I allowed myself to get to true, because true required the kind of exposure I had organized my entire life to avoid." The candles held their light around the room. No one moved. 200 people with 200 competing interests and 200 reasons to be watching this for what it meant to them sat in the complete suspension of people who have forgotten, for a moment, to watch for themselves. "I am not standing here to ask for anything," Lucien continued, and his voice had dropped slightly, not in volume but in register, the shift from the public address tone to something raw underneath it that the room strained to follow. "I am standing here because she deserves to have heard the truth in the most permanent form I know how to give it, before witnesses. On the record, without the option of my retreating to the managed version afterward." He paused. "I mistook emotional distance for strength. I built a life on the premise that needing nothing from another person meant you were invulnerable. What it actually meant was that I was unreachable. And the cruelest thing about being unreachable is that you don't feel the cost of it. The person who pays is the one standing next to you, spending years reaching across a distance you never acknowledged existed." Seraphina had not moved. Her glass was on the table in front of her, and both her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not in 3 years of proximity. Not in all the rooms they had occupied and all the silences they had shared. It was the expression of someone who is hearing a thing they had needed to hear for a very long time and had stopped expecting, and who is therefore not entirely sure what to do with the fact of its arrival. "I don't want to possess her," he said. "I don't want to correct the record, or recover a position, or win a situation. I want her to know, with you all as witness, permanently, without the possibility of my later claiming it was strategic, that her leaving was the most clarifying event of my adult life, that the emptiness she left behind was not the emptiness of a missing resource. It was the emptiness of a man who had not understood what he was living alongside until it was gone." His voice was level. It was costing him to keep it level, and the room could hear the cost, which was the point. "That is all. I have nothing further to say that belongs in this room." He sat down. The silence lasted another 3 seconds. Then Lord Miraval, who was 74 years old and had attended Ascension banquets for 5 decades, lifted his glass with the quiet deliberateness of a man making a personal decision rather than a social one, and drank. And the room, in its complicated, uncertain, thoroughly human way, exhaled. She found him on the East Terrace 20 minutes later. He had left the table at the first practical interval, not fleeing but removing himself from the ambient theater of 200 people processing what he had said and what it meant for the complicated social mathematics of the court. He needed air. He needed the specific simplicity of a space that wasn't performing anything at him. The terrace was cold and dark and empty. The city spread below it in its nighttime geography of lit windows and moving lanterns, the river visible at the distance as a darker dark running between the near lights and the far ones. He stood at the stone rail with his hands flat on the cold surface and breathed the night air and let himself be in the aftermath of it, not calculating what it had produced or what came next, just inhabiting the specific stillness of a man who has said the truest thing he knows how to say and has no plan for the moment after. He heard her step on the terrace stone behind him and did not turn immediately. Then he did. She had a shawl over her formal dress against the cold, which was the detail that struck him. The small, practical, unperformative accommodation to the fact that the night was cold and she was in it. She looked at him across the 8 feet of terrace stone between them with an expression that had organized itself since the banquet hall into something he could read more clearly. It was not the open warmth she gave to people who had never hurt her. It was something more specific than that. Something that had history in it, had the weight of 3 years and 4 weeks and 1 very long month, and a drawing room conversation and a public confession in the most watched room in the empire. It was the expression of a woman who has gone the full distance of a complicated thing and is standing at the far end of it deciding what she's carrying forward. "That was not small," she said. "No." "You knew what it would cost you, publicly." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "And you did it anyway, not to win something, not to change my decision." She tilted her head slightly. "Why?" He looked back at her across the cold, dark terrace. The city moved below them, indifferent and continuous, 800 years of accumulated human life going about its ordinary business without reference to the 2 people standing above it on a stone rail. "Because you spent 3 years making yourself available to someone who had never once made himself available in return," he said. "And the least I owed you was the one thing I had been deciding, over and over, not to give you, which was the truth about what you are to me. Not shaped, not positioned, the actual truth." He paused. "Even if it came 4 weeks after you stopped needing it from me." She was quiet for a moment. "I talked to Kael," she said. He waited. "Tonight, before I came out here." She moved to the rail, not beside him, but a few feet along it, looking out at the city with the profile that he had memorized, without intending to, somewhere in the long middle of 3 years. "He told me what he told you, that he wasn't proud of the intelligence access, that he understood it wasn't reconcilable with the other things he had said to me." She paused. "He was honest about it. He didn't try to make it smaller than it was." "He's an honest man," Lucien said. The words cost him something, and he paid it because it was accurate. "He is." She looked out at the city. "He said he loved me. He said he meant it, and still means it, and that it doesn't change what he did." Another pause. "He also said that whatever I decided, he wanted it to be on honest ground. He used that phrase." She turned to look at Lucien. "You use that phrase too, in the war chamber apparently." "Yes?" 2 men who competed for," she stopped on the word and chose another, "for my attention, arriving independently at the same phrase." Something quiet moved through her expression. "That's either coincidence or it means something got said between you that mattered." "It means," Lucien said, "that we both understood by the end that you were not a thing either of us was equipped to manage. We just arrived at that understanding by different routes." She looked at him. The cold was doing what cold did on open terraces, finding the gaps, moving through the shawl, settling into the specific chill of a late autumn night that didn't care about the occasion it was interrupting. She held herself against it with the quiet self-sufficiency he had always catalogued and never commented on, the quality of a woman who had learned over a long time not to expect warmth from her immediate environment and had therefore developed her own. He had contributed to that education. He sat with that knowledge the way he had been sitting with all of it, not collapsing under it, not routing it into action, just holding it accurately, because accurate was the baseline he now had to operate from if the alternative was continuing to be the person who looked away from things that were true. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "The man who stood up in that room tonight." She looked at him directly. "Is that who you are now, or is that who you are when you're trying to be something different?" The question landed with the clean precision of something she had been carrying the whole time she was walking out here. The question under all the other questions. The one that actually mattered. He thought about it honestly, which meant he didn't answer immediately, because the immediate answer would be the one his system generated for self-preservation, and he had made a specific decision to stop leading with that. "I don't know yet," he said, "whether I can sustain it. I know that I understand things I didn't understand 2 months ago. I know the understanding is real, and not performed because it costs me something to operate from it rather than from what I was before. I know that the man in the East study the morning you left, the one who said useful and believed that accurate was the same as adequate. I can't fully go back to being him, not because I've decided to be better, because I've seen too clearly what he was doing to the people around him." He looked at her. Whether that's change or whether it's just damage-producing knowledge, I don't know. I think it might take longer than 4 weeks to find out. She nodded slowly. The specific, honest nod of someone who has heard an answer they can work with precisely because it didn't claim more than it could support. Kyle is going back to the Vorin capital next month, she said. The diplomatic visit has a scheduled end. He told me tonight that he will write if I want to continue the acquaintance and that he will understand completely if I don't. She paused. He was graceful about it. He's a graceful man. He is, Lucien said. He deserved better from both of us than the situation he was placed in. Yes. She turned from the rail to face him fully, the city at her back, the candlelight from the hall windows falling across her at the angle that made the amber in her dress visible even in the dark. He looked at her and did not manage the looking, did not route it through the filter of what looking should communicate, did not calculate the optimal quality of eye contact for the desired outcome. He just looked at her the way he had been slowly learning to look at things he actually wanted to understand. I'm not ready, she said. I want you to know that clearly. Not as a negotiating position, not as a condition with terms attached, just factually. The last 2 months have been a great deal to process, and I am not standing here with everything sorted and a decision made. I know. And I'm not going back to Dravenmere Hall. I'm not asking you to. I need, she paused, finding the precise word. I need to see who you are when you're not in crisis. When there's no rival, no confrontation, no public occasion requiring a declaration. I need to see who you are on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing is at stake and there's no architecture supporting a particular version of you. Her voice was steady and specific. That's what 3 years of living in your house never showed me. The ordinary version. He looked at her in the night and felt something move through him that was quieter than everything that had come before it. Not the crack, not the cold empire breaking, not the desperate compressed energy of a man running towards something he'd almost lost. Something slower. Something that had the particular quality of a man understanding, for the first time, that what he wanted was not an outcome but a duration. Tuesday afternoon, he said. Figuratively. I understand the figure. He looked at her. I would like the opportunity to show you that version. I have no expectation about what you'll find there. I'm making no guarantees about what it looks like. He paused, and the pause was not strategy, just the specific difficulty of a man who is still learning the language he should have been speaking for years. I would like the chance to find out alongside you. She looked at him for a long time. The city below them was doing its ordinary, immortal thing. The candles in the hall behind them held their light against the dark. Somewhere inside, 200 people were having the conversation that his absence and her absence had created, the complicated ambient mathematics of court life processing a new piece of information and redistributing it across the social architecture. None of that had any weight standing here. All right, she said. 2 words. Quiet, specific, carrying nothing extra and nothing withheld. He breathed. Must. The peace treaty between the Veltharan Empire and the Vorin territories was finalized in the 3rd month of the following year, drawn through 2 weeks of formal negotiation that Lucien participated in as the Emperor's senior diplomatic representative, and Kyle Vorin concluded as his empire's chief signatory. They sat across the treaty table with the professional distance of men who understood that the room required a certain quality of separation between personal history and institutional function, and they both managed it because they were both, in their respective ways, competent at their jobs. On the last day of negotiations, Vorin signed the final document and set down his pen and looked across at Lucien with the settled, measuring attention that had characterized their very first encounter. She seems well, he said. Not as intelligence, as the simple statement of a man who had been watching from the appropriate distance, because caring about someone's well-being does not stop, because the situation resolves against you. She is, Lucien said. Vorin nodded once. Then he gathered his documents with the efficient finality of a man who has concluded what he came to conclude and left the room. Lucien sat in the treaty room alone for a few minutes afterward, in the particular quiet of a space that has just finished its purpose. He thought about the man Kyle Vorin was, the genuine, specific quality of him, The love that had been real even alongside the methods that had not been clean. The grace with which he had stepped away from something he wanted because the person at the center of it had made a different choice. There was, he understood, a debt in that. Not the financial kind, not the political kind. The human kind. The kind you carry not as obligation, but as the weight of knowing someone gave something up and did it without extracting the cost from you. He would carry that weight honestly. It was the least it deserved. They were married at Stormwatch Citadel on the first morning of early spring, when the sea below the bluffs was still running gray and the wind was still cold enough to matter, and the light had the thin, clarified quality of a season that has not yet decided to be generous. The ceremony was small by any standard that the court would have applied to a union of this significance. 40 people, the immediate family, the handful of friends who were genuine rather than strategic, Selwick standing near the back with the expression of a man who has survived 11 years of difficult employment and is experiencing something that may be relief. No formal procession, no imperial registry of witnesses beyond the necessary. Just the specific gathering of people who had been told the truth about what was happening and had chosen to be present. Seraphina wore ivory, simply cut, with her hair the way she wore it in the drawing room at Caldermere Square, half pinned and half loose, the version that belonged to her rather than to any occasion. She had chosen it deliberately, and he understood the choice, and loved it with the specific love of a man who has learned to read the things a person does for themselves rather than for the room. He stood beside her at the Citadel's seaward edge and looked at her and did not manage the looking. When the officiant had finished the formal words and asked whether there was anything either of them wished to say, the tradition being one of personal declaration. In addition to the formal rite, Seraphina turned to him and said very quietly, for him rather than the room, "You leaving me the choice?" That was the thing. Not the speech in the banquet hall, not the running, just that you learned to leave the choice entirely mine and didn't flinch waiting for it. He looked at her in the thin spring light with the cold coming off the sea, and thought about the morning she had walked out of his East study 3 seasons ago and how completely he had believed, in the architecture of his own certainty, that she would come back because he had decided she would. How the assumption had felt like confidence, and had actually been the last, most expensive form of the same mistake. The belief that what you hold stays held without the work of holding it. "Your departure," he said, "was the greatest humiliation of my life." She looked at him steadily. "And choosing you," she said, "has been the greatest act of mine." The sea moved below the Citadel bluffs in its continuous, indifferent way, working at the stone with the patient long-term commitment of something that does not need to win in any single hour, just persist through all of them. The guests behind them held their quiet. The wind came through with the cold, clean quality of a morning that has not yet been asked to be anything in particular. He took her hand. Not the formal grip of the ceremony, the practiced gesture of the occasion, the actual way, fingers finding their natural arrangement, the specific pressure of 2 people deciding to hold on, the quiet physical grammar of something that does not need to announce itself. She let him. In the months that followed, people who knew the Duke of Dravenmere and had known him for years described a change they could not precisely locate. He was not softer. He was not less effective in the rooms where effectiveness mattered, not less feared by the people for whom fear was the appropriate response, not reduced in any of the ways that the court, in its relentless social accounting, would have logged as weakness. He was simply present in a different way, as though a frequency had been adjusted, some ambient quality of self-containment dialed down from the level that had made him, for over a decade, a room-clearing force rather than a room-inhabiting one. He asked questions, real ones, the kind with no predetermined answer, the kind you ask when you are actually interested in what comes back. He listened to the answers with the full attention he had previously reserved for information that had strategic value, and the people on the receiving end of it, staff, advisors, the junior nobles who had spent years navigating the architecture of his indifference, felt the specific disorienting quality of being genuinely attended to by someone whose attention they had never expected to receive. He was not a different man. He was the same man, having learned the most expensive lesson available to a person who has spent their life confusing the accumulation of power with the construction of meaning. that strength is not the absence of need, that the refusal to be moved is not the same as being unbreakable, that the hardest thing a person built the way he was built can do is not to conquer one more territory or neutralize one more opponent, but to stand in a room with no defenses deployed and say, "This is what I am, and I would like to be accountable for it." He had stood in that room. He was still standing in it. That was not the end of the difficulty. Difficulty, as he had always understood, did not conclude, it just changed form. There would be mornings when the old architecture asserted itself, when the reflex toward management won out over the intention toward honesty, when she would look at him with the specific quality of a woman who can tell the difference, and he would have to make the choice again, not once but repeatedly, the way every real thing requires. He made the choice, not because he had transformed into something unrecognizable, because he had looked, finally and without flinching, at the cost of the alternative, had stood in the cold ruin of everything he had taken for granted, and understood that the man he was building in the aftermath was the only version of himself he could inhabit without the slow, ambient shame of knowing he was capable of more than he was willing to risk. The empire ran. The seasons moved. The East study filled and emptied with the ordinary operations of a consequential life. And in the evenings, in the rooms of Stormwatch Citadel and Dravenmere Hall, and the small house near the coast they eventually acquired because she had said once, in a drawing room 4 years before any of this, that she had always wanted to be able to hear the sea. In those rooms, with the light doing its ordinary indifferent things and the world outside running its continuous business, Lucien Dravenmere learned the specific, daily, unspectacular discipline of being someone worth staying near. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. It was also, he came to understand, the only conquest that had ever meant anything.